West Penwith is a unique and ancient landscape lying right at the very tip of the UK. This iconic area of Cornwall is home to moorlands, meadows, rugged coastlines, ancient sites and communities of wildlife and people. The Penwith Landscape Partnership has uncovered many ancient sites, restored depleted habitats, engaged and connected with landowners, farmers, local communities and conservation organisations, enabling them to come together to reconnect the landscape for both people and wildlife. In this short series of podcasts, we explore the project's achievements and highlight how you can help us to preserve and protect the landscape for years to come. In this episode, Katie, the PLP Digital Communications Officer, and Tony, our resident Cornish language expert, talk about the Cornish language in the landscape.
Hello everyone, welcome to another podcast from the Penwith Landscape Partnership. I'm Katie and I'm a Digital Communications Officer, and my area of work covers communications and interpretation, and also I manage a project called Taking Names. This particular project focuses on the Cornish language in the landscape, and Cornish is such a massive part of Penwith, we really couldn't not include Cornish. And I am delighted to introduce Tony Phillips, who's joining.
Good afternoon, everybody. I agree with you completely about the Cornish language and the landscape and how it comes together. And in Penwith and West Penwith in particular, there is a real flavour of the landscape and the use of the language, which I think we need to preserve as much as we can.
Absolutely. So, Tony, did you want to give a little bit of information about yourself and how you got involved with the project?
I initially got involved with the project when it was first being planned, actually. And I went to one of the information days down at St John's Hall in Penzance. I was actually really too excited because there were too many exciting things happening with the archaeology, the history, the landscape, the scrub clearance, the habitat work. And I couldn't decide what I really fancied focusing on. And it wasn't until I was talking to other people I was working with learning Cornish that I found out that there was the Cornish language element. And because I've been working in local schools with children, I then decided that this could be an opportunity here to really bring the language into the forefront of the landscape. That's what made me decide to do it. And so I then applied, and I was delighted to be appointed with another individual, Loveday Jenkins. And we have been the Kernewek, the Cornish language team for Penwith Landscape Partnership. And although we're very much part of the Taking Names project, we actually feed into all the other areas as well.
That is such a core part of your work because Cornish is present in so much of Penwith that pretty much none of the project stands could exist without a bit of Cornish being thrown in, because it's such an important part of what's still happening in the landscape down here. So do you want to share a little bit about the work that you and Loveday have been doing for the programme of the Cornish language in Penwith?
Yeah, I'm just trying to decide where to begin really, because we've done a variety of things. We have acted as sort of language consultants for the whole team. If they were doing anything with signage or advertising or newsletters and things like that. So we'd offer advice on that. We'd also be looking at when the access officer and the access team were doing walks through the landscape. Quite often they'd want the Cornish element to go in it as well, so we'd support that. And we'd look at the place names and what they meant in order to make them come alive for people. We've also had a range of fun sessions, Blaza Kernewek, a taste of Cornish sessions. We also had a bit of a taste of Giva and cafes and coffee rooms when we do it. But that brings people together, and just to have a go and to get a flavour of the language and enjoy it together. Another element that I've really enjoyed is working with the different volunteer teams, whether they're working up Sperriscoit or Malfravine or over St Buryan Way. And I'd join them for the day, and it would just be informal, dropping Cornish into the conversation about place names around that area and just informing them. And they could just ask me questions if they wanted to or not. But I think it just helped bind everybody together a bit more, because the one thing I have found with the Penwith Landscape Partnership is it is actually a very strong family of people working together.
Absolutely, I think that's very true. And we've been very lucky to be supported by a very strong community within the team, the volunteers, our partners, and lots of people in the local area. You've also shared touches of Cornish with our wildlife recording group.
Yes, I've been working with the Wildlife Recording Group, and we were looking at Skinnisvan last Friday, which was spiders. We've looked at all sorts of other things. I've also done a training day for them. We did a bilingual butterfly day. So I was using my knowledge of butterflies, because I'm a recorder for Cornwall Butterfly Conservation and also a species champion for the small heath butterfly. And so we went out on a transect and we did it all bilingually, and it was really exciting. The same as we've done other bilingual walks around St Just or around Zena. Also did some for the Gorseth when it was in St Just. Also did some for the Ordinalia. So that was another big mix. And one of the things we have really enjoyed is working with some of the local farming families, where we might get together for possibly even 5 generations of the same farming families. And we'd be looking at the history of the farming and in particular the field names from the farms, because the old Cornish field names tell us a lot about what the landscape was like and what the landscape was being used for. And that is an invaluable tool. So we'd then be really busy then trying to get hold of the old manorial records, or maybe the tithe apportionments from Crescent Kernewek, the Cornwall Records Office, and try and pull all that together. And it usually comes together and you can sort of present it to the group in quite a straightforward, easy, relaxed way.
Absolutely. And yes, the field names work, I think, has been particularly valuable, because as you say, you can learn quite a lot of little gems of knowledge about the farms. Have you got a particular field name that sticks in your memory?
There's several that stick in my memory, actually. I think one of them that I really like is Park Mayon, or the Field of Stones. It's actually on the Coffin Walk from Zena, heading towards St Ives. But this field has huge granite boulders in it, and they're all submerged, well submerged. And we can bring in the legends as well, the stories of the giants and how they'd throw them and hurl them at each other across West Penwith and things like that. But we also learn from each other, because there was a lady on the walk from Wales who says, we call them sleeping whales. That means that we mustn't disturb them. They're just resting, and they may just get up and go back in the sea at some point. And I just thought that was a lovely little touch. And I think that, to me, is the key thing about the Penwith Landscape Partnership, is everybody learning off each other. Whether it's me offering some Cornish, or Nick offering some wildlife, or Matt offering some access info, or yourself with IT info. It's just everybody's pitching in. They want to do a good job, and let's have a laugh as well.
Absolutely, and any sessions like that, we always try to make them fun as well as informative. Just so important, because otherwise people wouldn't turn up, would they? Let's be fair.
No.
Talk about fun. You've also done quite a lot of work with schools.
Yes. I mean, as part of my history, I used to be a teacher. Before that, I was a mechanic, and before that, I was a fisherman. But yes, and I must have had a midlife crisis and decided to train as a teacher. Over the course of the project, in the last 2.5-3 years, Lovedie and I, between us, we've now worked with over 2,500 primary age school children, because we think it's important that children that age get to know their landscape, get to know their heritage. We need to make sure that they grow up and get out there and see it. So we took children from Tridal School. We walked part of St Michael's Way. We also did it so that we finished at Tremere Sculpture Garden, and we had a big picnic. Again, that was all lovely, storytelling, and then we got the children to teach their parents what we taught them on how to ask for their cream tea and everything. So that was a great afternoon that finished well. The other project we did was going out into the moors, visiting old heritage sites like Men Toll, the old stone, Men Screefer, the inscribed stone, Budrifty, the ancient village, Nine Maidens, Don's Mayon, the Stone Circle, and also Carngalva. But at each site, they did more storytelling, finding out about the heritage, appreciating and caring for the environment around them. They then produced their own stories and artwork. That was then put together into folders. That then went into waterproof boxes along with a feedback booklet for visitors to write in, or parents or anybody else, and they were left at these sites for months. And we go back and have a look, and the comment books were filling up and filling up. People were really enjoying finding them, reading them, praising the children. So that made the children feel really good. And what crowned it for us really was we entered both projects for the Gorseth Kernewek Children and Young People's Awards, the Cornish Gorseth, the Bards. And we actually won first place for Cornish Language Studies, and we also won first place the Arwen Awards for Cornish Heritage Studies. So, the children did a fantastic job, and they remember it to this day. So that's important.
It really is, and I think it also helps because I think a lot of us have a legacy of language being quite intimidating from our school days, which I think maybe why learning language isn't quite as prevalent as it could be. So I think you've been able to reach out to the children at that age and to let them experience the landscape, which is literally just outside their doorstep, is really important.
Yes, and I think what you say there is key. It's on their doorstep, and we want to keep it on their doorstep, and we want to keep it as a living, working environment, a living, working landscape that they may well stay here and work in themselves. They may not, but if they do stay, then we want them to cherish it, to nurture it, to keep it going, as we hope the project has, in its own way, achieved.
So we talked a bit about successes in the project. Would you say you've encountered any challenges along the way? I know there's that big kind of thing called COVID-19, which kind of reared its head.
Yeah, that created a few organisationals. And then also the knock-on from that, I think, as well, is that even when there weren't the COVID restrictions, people were slightly hesitant to do anything in a more confined space. So we had to try and find ways of, well, how can we do this in an easier way? So we thought, well, let's bring some stories alive. Let's take some of the old Cornish folk tales and legends and maybe do something with them, and maybe tell the tale on one of the walks or something, so you're outdoors, you can be socially distanced. And I tell you, I've got a fairly powerful voice, but trying to throw that at 30 people all trying to be socially distanced on a cliff top blowing a hoolie, it doesn't come easy. But I think Loveday and I have got quite loud voices when we need to. So we did stories of the miners. Another one we did were the wrestlers of Hooting Carn, Om Delory and Kernewek.
You just touched there on some of the folklore. It's a smaller element of taking names, but it's an area that I find absolutely fascinating because you can't really walk 10 paces in Penwith without bumping into a folk tale about the location you've just found yourself in, because it's kind of like the nature of the area, really. Very rich. Very fun. It's been great fun discovering some of these tales. Have you got a particular tale or legend that's your favourite?
Johan Chianor, Ondalorian, Kernewek. The Joe and... I've forgotten the name now. Chianor. That is a sort of folk legend, I think originally from Eastern Europe, that has worked its way across Europe, came down to West Cornwall. And, it's the classic sort of man on a mission through life, 3 rules, don't break the rules, things will be good and all that sort of thing. But alongside that, there's the Bosun family in Newlyn, I think in the late 1700s, whose mother wouldn't let them learn Cornish, because if you wanted to get on in the world, learn English. But they went and learnt Cornish off the local fishermen. And they knew this tale from having heard it over the years. So one of them, and I can't remember which one, I do apologise, but one of the boys wrote the story in Cornish at that time. And he wrote it in such a way, because it was such a repetitive pattern, which is good for learning language anyway. He then did that so that it covered pretty well most bits of grammar he would need to teach his own children Cornish, and so it became a tool then for following on. So it's got all your classic folk story elements and the repetition, but you've also got this added sort of backstory of somebody wanting to teach their own children the Cornish language, because it was gradually diminishing. It wasn't being used very much. As his mother said, you wouldn't get anywhere unless you speak English. We spoke about field names earlier, and by that time, probably about 50% of Cornish field names had been redesigned and renamed in English. So there's quite a big shift, a big social shift going on there. Yeah.
I think that's really fascinating, because it helps put everything into the context of the landscape and the times when these stories came about. And that is kind of one of the nice things I love about these sort of tales, is they help to bring the landscape to life as well and give you an idea of it, as well as being fascinating stories in their own right. And I think that thing that helped Cornish survive is absolutely brilliant. And then there's the whole Dolly Pentreath legend, which that last Cornish speaker allegedly, which I think we all now know is not true. And obviously Cornish has survived and is now doing rather well, thankfully, although obviously we could do a lot more with it. So having done so much work over the last few years for us, do you have a particularly favourite memory or something that made you laugh along the way?
I do remember, I think we were doing some work down at the Giant's House, which is, I think, on the Cranken side of New Mill. Yes. And I know the area fairly well, yet I honestly didn't know it that well. For having stanked around there with the dogs over the years, I never knew or anything about this Giant's House. So I had to go along and find out what's going on. And Cranken is an interesting place because, excuse me a moment, I'm just going to go off on a tangent.
That's fine.
Briefly. But the Cranken Rhyme is a very short poem written, I believe, in late Cornish, which is one of the last pieces of written Cornish. And I think from, is it the 1800s? But I can't remember exactly. But it was written by Davy from Boswednock, who became the teacher at Zena. And what I like about it is he's comparing Cranken to somewhere else. Cranken in Cornish, in fact, that whole side, well, not that whole side, but nearly a lot of that side of the valley, you've got Cranken, which is basically the house of misery and sorrow. Not a good thing. And when the owner of the farm came over to me in the field and said, "So what's Cranken mean then?" And I told him. He wasn't too happy, to be honest. But I did try and cheer him up by saying, "But the farm just down from you, Noongallis, that means the stony downs, which means it's no good for growing things either. So, don't worry about that." And he said, "Well, what about the other side of the valley?" And I said, "Well, I don't really want to tell you." "Well, you've got Basiljat, which is the profitable farm. You've got Treweithiel, which is the place where you can grow really good root crops because the soil's so good. And this is all from the field names and place names. So it's all a bit worrying. But it does give you that flavour of what the ground was like." And I told him about the rhyme, and it basically compares trying to grow something at Cranken and the fact that you can grow more on the old dirt track between Penzance and Marazion. So it was a bit, he was a bit disheartened and thought he might perhaps just stay with cattle.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame him. I think after that, and you can even see the anglicised, I suppose, versions of some of the place names. You get kind of things like Break My Neck Lane, don't you, and Devil's Lane, and that kind of thing in the area, which is probably indications about how people felt about bits of the landscape.
Oh yes, Bounder Crackiacodna. You mentioned the Break My Neck Lane. That is so named because it is on a steep slope, and the farm is called Crackiacodna Farm as well. It is the sort of slope where if you don't drive it carefully, you can tip a trailer very easily. But interestingly, there's also Cargodna Shaft on the cliffs at St Just, just down from Wheel Owls, which means, the very steep shaft, the very steep cliff. And that's where there was a mining disaster in the late 1800s, where one mine had broken into the other mine and then they were flooded. So I think people can have a raised awareness of what life was like, what hardships perhaps people having to put up with. But, you could write a book on fishing, you could write a book on mining, you could write a book on... Maybe one day.
Yes, it's one thing that I've learnt from doing folklore posts and things that you and Loveday have done is that how rich the fun of the folklore and the tales are about those professions that have kind of always underpinned Penwith, so mining, fishing and farming, and kind of like the big three. But of course there's traditional crafts and all those sort of things, but it's all those people of Penwith that kind of have come together and shaped that landscape over thousands of years. So I agree. I think it's really important to recognise what's happened with the people who've come before us that we now are inheriting as individuals. And we touched on earlier about how some people might find learning a new language or elements of something like Cornish quite intimidating. What advice would you have for someone who may be interested in learning a bit of Cornish but doesn't know where to start?
I suggest you ask around. There's various places that run beginners courses in Cornish, one of which is Class and High, the Haymore class. They run beginners classes right through to grade 4. You don't have to do exams. It's all about, being interested. You can be with like-minded people, but you can also learn the language online through KDL, Kernewek Drelitha. There's a few apps, if you like an app on your phone and you want to learn a bit. So there's various ones there, like Say Something in Cornish, or Memrise, or You Talk. So there's ways of finding out.
Fantastic, thank you very much. If you do want to learn more about Cornish in Penwith and the work that Tony and Loveday have been doing, there is a section on the Penwith Landscape Partnership website, which is penwithlandscape.com. Now, I'm sure no one's missed the fact that not much of this podcast has been in Cornish, and I'm going to confess just because I do not speak much Cornish whatsoever, which is why we have been so lucky and privileged to have Tony and Loveday doing this work for us, and to have so many keen people getting involved in all the various workshops, online activities and stuff that they have done. It's been brilliant. But I'm going to leave the last word to Tony, who's going to read out a piece in Cornish for us.
Thank you. Otoma recordus agenhender, gans I gingle a alcio, I asken cain a hallo hacarn, I ession kins historic, I hen grossio, fentinio ha chapelio, I velinio dar ha huelios den, hagi drivo kes carac gans aga fentronio, and raulis a willio cadroia. Haga roswaith mello a hinzio ha henfortho. In henwin gwelio ma an histori Kernewek a gaus orthin in lev I henyeth. And if you'd like that in English, here are records of our ancient lands with its girdle of cliffs, its backbone of moors and carns, its prehistoric remains, its ancient crosses, wells and chapels, its watermills and tin works, and its scattered farmsteads with their irregular patterns of stone-walled fields, and their connecting network of paths and tracks. In these field names, Cornwall's past speaks to us in the voice of her ancient language. And that quote has come from Peter Poole, author of The Field Names of West Penwith, 1990 edition.
Thanks to Katie and Tony. Next week we have Nick, the PLP ecologist, and Abby and Kevin, PLP volunteers, talking about the Penwith Wildlife Recording Group. The Penwith Landscape Partnership is a 5-year project supported by National Lottery players through the National Lottery Heritage Fund. To find out more about our work and our partners, please head to penwithlandscape.com. For links and references from each episode, please refer to the show notes. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review on your podcast platform. Thanks for listening.